Tonight, we uncover the secrets of a scroll so ancient, so forbidden, that it disappeared into the shadows of history, its pages lost for millennia. A manuscript that tells the story of giants, being so vast, so powerful, that their very existence threatened to unbalance the world itself. These giants were born of gods and humans, a forbidden union that birthed a monstrous race whose violence and corruption would shape the fate of the world. But what if these giants were more than just myth? What if they were part of a forgotten truth, a story erased by those who feared its power? For centuries, this lost tradition remained hidden, sealed away in caves, erased from history by the hands of those who sought to control what you knew. And now, as fragments of the story resurface, we begin to piece together a narrative that could change everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. But be warned, this is no ordinary tale. This is a story of forbidden knowledge, a warning from a time long past, one that might just shatter everything we've been taught. So before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe, because what you're about to discover is not for the faint of heart. 1,000 years before anyone wrote the word history, whispers already moved through the ancient world, quiet warnings about a time before the flood, when the earth itself had gone wrong. Long before modern Bibles were fixed into their final form, Jewish scribes living during the late Second Temple period copied traditions far older than their own age. These scribes did not see themselves as inventors of myth, but as guardians of memory, preserving fragments handed down through generations. Among those fragments was a disturbing idea that before the Great Flood, beings known as giants walked the earth, not as legends, but as symbols of a world that had crossed a moral boundary. These traditions did not emerge in isolation. They appear in early Hebrew texts, in Aramaic writings, and later in works scholars now group under what is called Enochic literature. During the centuries between the rebuilding of the Second Temple and its destruction by Rome, Jewish communities were deeply concerned with questions of evil, corruption, and divine judgment. The story of giants fit perfectly into that fear. According to these traditions, the giants were not merely large humans. They were the result of forbidden unions, described briefly in the book of Genesis, where the sons of God took wives from the daughters of men. Those few lines became the seed for a much larger explanation of why the flood was necessary at all. To the scribes, the giants represented unchecked power, violence without restraint, and knowledge used without wisdom. This was not a fairy tale told to children, but a warning preserved for survival. Archaeology confirms that during the Second Temple period, scribes were actively copying and expanding older texts, especially those dealing with the origins of evil. Manuscripts found centuries later near the Dead Sea show that these ideas were widespread, copied carefully, and treated seriously. The giants were remembered not because they were impressive, but because they were dangerous. They symbolized a final generation before collapse, a world so corrupted that renewal required destruction. The scribe who recorded these traditions believed he was living in another fragile age, surrounded by empires, violence, and moral decay. Writing about the giants was a way to look backward in order to understand the present. The message was subtle, but clear. When boundaries are crossed, consequences follow. The flood was not sudden or meaningless. It was the result of a long process of corruption, remembered through the shadow of giants whose existence marked the moment humanity went too far. For a young listener today, the power of this tradition lies in its warning rather than its mystery. Ancient writers weren't obsessed with size or spectacle. They were concerned with responsibility, limits, and memory. By preserving the image of giants, Second Temple scribes were saying that history repeats when lessons are ignored. What happened before the flood was not forgotten. It was deliberately remembered, so it would never happen again. These whispers survived because silence would have been more dangerous. 4 short lines in the book of Genesis have caused more debate than entire chapters of ancient history. In Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, the text slows down and becomes strangely quiet, as if it knows it is revealing something dangerous. It speaks of sons of God, daughters of men, and a group called the Nephilim, described only briefly as mighty ones of old. No explanation is offered, no background is given. The verses appear and then vanish, leaving behind questions that never fully went away. For ancient readers, this silence was not accidental. Early Jewish interpreters understood these lines as a warning, not a puzzle meant to be solved easily. During the centuries when these texts were copied by hand, scribes treated these verses with caution, aware that they pointed to events that helped explain why the flood was necessary. The phrase sons of God did not mean kings or heroes in the earliest traditions. In ancient Hebrew thought, it referred to heavenly beings, members of a divine council, a concept shared across the ancient Near East. The daughters of men were human women, ordinary people drawn into an imbalance far beyond their control. The result of this union was the Nephilim, beings described as powerful and violent, whose presence marked a turning point in human history. What makes these lines so haunting is not what they say, but what they refuse to explain. There are no speeches, no names, no detailed stories. That absence created space for interpretation, and early Jewish writers filled that space carefully. Texts like the Book of Enoch expanded these 4 lines into a fuller explanation of corruption, forbidden knowledge, and moral collapse. This was not an attempt to add drama, but to answer a serious question about how the world could fall so far that it needed to be washed clean. By the time of the Second Temple period, these verses were already ancient. They were copied, preserved, and debated by scribes who believed they contained the key to understanding evil. Archaeological discoveries from the Judean desert show that Genesis was read alongside other texts that explained these verses in greater detail. This suggests that early Jewish communities didn't see Genesis 6 as complete on its own. It was a doorway, not a conclusion. The Nephilim were not remembered as heroes. They were remembered as a symptom of imbalance. Their existence showed what happens when boundaries between heaven and earth are ignored. Violence increases, order collapses, life loses balance. Genesis 6 verses 1 through 4 remain unchanged because they were never meant to comfort. They were meant to unsettle. In just a few lines, they introduce a world already broken, setting the stage for the flood long before the rain begins. The silence of these verses invites reflection rather than certainty, leaving listeners with unease instead of answers. That unease is intentional. It warns without explaining. It prepares the listener for judgment, and it refuses to soften its message, ever. In the writings known today as early Enochic tradition, the silence of Genesis begins to speak. These texts, preserved in fragments and later rediscovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, introduce figures called the Watchers. They are described as heavenly beings assigned to observe the earth, not to rule it. Their role was oversight, not involvement. According to these traditions, the crisis before the flood did not begin with humans alone, but with a decision made above them. The Watchers are said to have looked upon humanity and crossed a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. This idea was not unique to one text. Similar concepts appear across the ancient Near East, where divine beings formed councils and were expected to maintain order. In the Enochic worldview, the Watchers failed that responsibility. They descended to earth, not out of duty, but desire. This descent is described not as an accident, but as a choice, a deliberate turning away from their assigned place. Ancient scribes treated this moment as the true beginning of corruption. The Watchers did not only take human wives, they brought with them knowledge meant to remain in the heavens. Early Enoch texts list forbidden teachings, such as advanced metalworking, warfare, cosmetics, astrology, and secret names. These were not neutral skills. They altered how humans lived, fought, and understood power. The result was imbalance. Violence increased. Social order fractured. For the writers of these texts, knowledge without restraint was as dangerous as physical force. The Watchers became symbols of authority misused and curiosity without limits. Historically, scholars date the composition of these Enochic traditions to the centuries leading up to the Common Era, a time when Jewish communities were wrestling with foreign rule and moral anxiety. The idea that even heavenly beings could fall resonated deeply. It explained why evil felt overwhelming and why it seemed to come from systems larger than any single person. The Watchers weren't demons in the later sense. They were once obedient beings who chose wrongly. That distinction mattered. It meant corruption was not created by God, but by choice. Archaeological evidence from Qumran shows that these texts were copied and valued, suggesting they were widely read and discussed. They were not fringe fantasies. They were serious attempts to understand why the world appeared broken. The descent of the Watchers reframed the flood story. The flood was no longer just a response to human sin, but a reset after a cosmic failure. When the Watchers stepped onto the earth, heaven and earth collided in the wrong way. Order collapsed. The crisis began long before rain fell from the sky. By recording this descent, ancient scribes were offering a warning about power and responsibility. Knowledge carried consequences they believed could not be escaped. Even heavenly beings were accountable for their actions. The Watcher's story exists to explain that truth. It frames rebellion as a cause, not a hero, and it prepares the listener for what comes next: judgment, consequence, collapse, flood, reset. When the Watchers crossed the boundary between heaven and earth, the result was not harmony, but something entirely new and deeply unsettling. Early Jewish texts describe the birth of the giants as the natural consequence of that forbidden union, beings who did not belong fully to either realm. These giants appear in ancient sources under different names: Nephilim in Genesis, Gibborim in later Hebrew usage, and simply giants in translations. But the idea remains consistent. They were powerful, violent, and uncontrollable. According to Enochic tradition, they grew rapidly and consumed far more than the land could sustain. Their size was symbolic, not just physical, but moral. Everything about them was excessive. Ancient writers were not focused on fantasy details. They were explaining disorder. The giants represented what happens when limits are broken and power exists without restraint. Texts describe them devouring human food, then animals, and finally turning on humanity itself. Violence spread as they fought among themselves and ruled over people through fear. This was not presented as a myth meant to entertain. It was a diagnosis of a broken world. Archaeological context helps explain why these descriptions mattered. The communities that preserved these writings lived under constant threat: famine, warfare, and foreign domination. The image of giants consuming everything mirrored real experiences of oppression and collapse. The giants were not admired, they were feared. In the Book of Enoch and related texts, their actions directly contribute to the corruption of the earth. Bloodshed becomes constant, justice disappears, life loses balance. Even the land is described as crying out. This language reflects ancient beliefs that moral failure affected the natural world itself. The giants were not just sinners, they were agents of chaos. Their hunger symbolized systems that take without giving back, power that destroys instead of protects. Historically, these traditions were shaped during periods when Jewish thinkers were trying to understand why suffering seemed endless. By tracing violence back to the birth of the giants, the texts offered an explanation that went beyond human weakness alone. Something had gone wrong at the foundation. The giants also blurred categories that ancient societies depended on. They were neither divine nor human, neither lawful nor fully outlawed. This made them dangerous. Ancient cultures depended on clear boundaries to maintain order. The giants existed outside those boundaries. That is why their presence is always followed by judgment. In these texts, the giants do not survive long after their rise. Their very existence is portrayed as unsustainable. They grow too violent, too destructive, too consuming. The flood is presented as the final response to a world overwhelmed by their influence. Importantly, the giants are never shown as misunderstood heroes. They do not seek redemption. They do not change. Their fate is sealed by their nature. For ancient listeners, this was a warning encoded in memory. Power without limits leads to collapse. When authority is disconnected from responsibility, destruction follows. The birth of the giants marks the moment the world tips past recovery. Everything that comes after, judgment, flood, and renewal, flows from that single imbalance. The giants were not remembered because they were impressive. They were remembered because they showed how quickly a world can be ruined when the wrong forces are allowed to grow unchecked. The ancient texts make it clear that the Watchers' greatest offense was not simply who they took, but what they taught. In early Enochic tradition, their descent to earth is followed immediately by the release of what are called heavenly secrets. These were forms of knowledge believed to belong only to the divine realm, guarded because of their power to reshape human behavior. The Watchers revealed skills related to metalworking, weapon-making, warfare strategy, astrology, sorcery, cosmetics, and secret names. To a modern listener, some of these may sound harmless or even useful. To ancient communities, they represented a dangerous acceleration of human capability without moral readiness. The problem was not knowledge itself. It was timing, intention, and control. In the worldview of these texts, humanity was not prepared to wield such power responsibly. Once released, these teachings spread rapidly. Tools became weapons. Observation of the stars turned into attempts to control fate. Beauty practices fed obsession and rivalry. Names meant to invoke authority were used to dominate others. The result was corruption that moved faster than conscience. Violence increased not only because people were cruel, but because they now had better means to act on cruelty. Early Jewish writers saw this as a pattern. When advanced knowledge enters a society without ethical restraint, imbalance follows. Historically, this concern reflects real anxieties of the ancient world. Periods of rapid technological change often brought instability. Communities living under empire understood how tools and knowledge could be used to control populations. By projecting these fears back into primeval history, the Enochic writers were making sense of their present. The Watchers became symbols of teachers without accountability. They did not guide, they unleashed. Archaeological evidence from Second Temple period texts shows that these ideas were widely circulated. Multiple manuscripts list the forbidden teachings in similar sequences, suggesting a shared tradition rather than random invention. The message was consistent. Knowledge, divorced from responsibility, leads to ruin. In these writings, the giants inherit not only physical strength, but corrupted instruction. They use what they have learned to dominate the land. Humanity, caught between heavenly knowledge and earthly weakness, collapses under the pressure. Importantly, the texts do not portray humans as innocent victims. People accept the teachings, they use them. Corruption spreads because it is useful. This makes the warning sharper. Destruction is rarely forced. It is invited. The Watcher's crime therefore becomes layered. They break boundaries. They teach what should remain guarded, and they refuse to repair the damage. In the Enochic worldview, this is why judgment becomes unavoidable. Once knowledge is released, it cannot be recalled. The world moves in a new direction. The flood is framed not as punishment for curiosity, but as a response to a system that could no longer correct itself. These texts survived because they warned future generations. Power without wisdom destroys both teacher and student. The lesson was meant to endure, especially when knowledge spreads faster than conscience. That danger defined the age before the flood. Today, still. In the middle of the growing chaos described by the ancient texts, one human figure steps forward, not as a hero, but as a messenger. His name is Enoch. In the earliest layers of Jewish tradition, Enoch is not famous for power, strength, or leadership. He is remembered because he listens. Genesis describes him briefly as a man who walked with God, then vanished from the world. That silence opened the door for later writers to explain his role in greater detail. In Enochic literature, he becomes the bridge between heaven and earth at the moment when communication has almost completely broken down. The Watchers, once confident and powerful, now face the consequences of their actions. According to these texts, even they fear what is coming. They know judgment is approaching, but they cannot face it directly. They turn to Enoch, not because he is stronger than they are, but because he is human. This detail matters. The warning is delivered through someone grounded in the world that is about to be judged. Enoch does not seek this role. He is summoned. The texts emphasize his reluctance, not his ambition. He does not negotiate. He does not soften the message. He records it. In the Book of Enoch, he is instructed to write down what he sees and hears, preserving the verdict rather than altering it. This reflects the worldview of Second Temple scribes who believed truth has survived through faithful transmission, not personal interpretation. Historically, Enoch became an important figure during a time when Jewish communities felt trapped between divine expectation and human failure. His role as mediator offered structure to a frightening idea that corruption had grown so severe that even angels were beyond repair. Enoch delivers the message that the watchers seek forgiveness too late. Their sentence is already sealed. They are told their offspring will perish, and that they themselves will witness the destruction they helped create. The giants will fall, the earth will be cleansed, there will be no appeal. This moment marks a shift in the narrative. The crisis is no longer theoretical, it is confirmed. Judgment is no longer distant, it is announced. Enoch's authority comes not from force, but from accuracy. He speaks what he is shown. Archaeological evidence from the Dead Sea Scrolls confirms that these passages were copied carefully and repeatedly, suggesting their importance. Enoch represents a model of obedience in contrast to the Watchers. He does not cross boundaries, he respects them. This contrast is deliberate. The texts frame Enoch as proof that faithfulness remains possible even in a corrupted world. His role does not stop the flood. It explains it. For ancient listeners, Enoch's presence reinforced a sobering idea. When warning is given and ignored, judgment follows. The message delivered through Enoch does not ask for fear. It demands awareness. The silence of heaven is broken one last time, not to negotiate, but to declare an end. And once the message is spoken, nothing can reverse it. As the corruption of the world reaches its peak, the ancient texts describe a strange turning point, the moment when even the giants begin to fear what is coming. In the Book of Giants and related Enochic fragments, the giants are no longer shown as confident rulers of the land. Instead, they are troubled by dreams. These dreams arrive without warning and without mercy. They are filled with images of destruction, uprooted trees, rising waters, and a world stripped clean of life. For ancient audiences' dreams were not random thoughts. They were believed to be messages, especially when they repeated and disturbed sleep. The giants, despite their strength, do not understand what they are seeing. This confusion is important. It shows that power does not equal knowledge. The dreams do not flatter them, they accuse them. In surviving fragments from Qumran, the giants describe visions where the earth is judged and their own existence is erased. The imagery is symbolic, but clear. Flooding represents total reset. Uprooted trees represent lineages cut off. Burning ground represents judgment that cannot be escaped. These dreams mark the first time fear enters the giant's world. Until now, violence flowed outward. Now, it turns inward. Historically, these dream sequences reflect a common ancient belief that warnings come before catastrophe. In Mesopotamian and biblical traditions alike, dreams often serve as early signs of divine action. The giants receiving dreams aligns them with human figures who are warned before disaster. The difference is that the giants cannot change course. They sense the meaning, but lack the ability to stop it. According to the texts, the giants gather and discuss these dreams, realizing that something beyond their control is approaching. This moment strips them of their mythic confidence. They are no longer monsters ruling the land. They are frightened beings awaiting interpretation. The dreams force them to confront the idea that their power has limits. That realization is terrifying. In the Enochic worldview, fear itself becomes evidence of guilt. Innocence does not fear judgment. The giant's panic confirms what has already been decided. Their world is ending. Archaeological evidence shows that these dream narratives were preserved with care, indicating their importance to the larger message. They explain why the giants seek Enoch. They do not look for weapons or escape. They look for meaning. This reflects an ancient understanding that knowledge arrives before destruction, even when it cannot save. The dreams do not offer hope. They offer clarity. The giants learn that the flood will not discriminate. Their strength will not matter. Their size will not protect them. Everything they consumed will be taken from them. For ancient listeners, this was a powerful reversal. The most feared beings in the world are reduced to sleeplessness and dread. The dreams act as a final warning, not to the giants alone, but to anyone listening. When corruption reaches a certain point, signs appear. Nature speaks. Sleep becomes uneasy. The future presses into the present. The giants' dreams are not meant to inspire sympathy. They are meant to show inevitability. Once a world is too broken, even monsters sense the end approaching. And when that realization arrives, it is already too late. Among the fragments of the Book of Giants, one figure emerges as an intermediary, a giant named Mawei. He is not just another offspring of the Watchers. He carries the weight of the giants' fear and their need for understanding. The ancient texts describe Mawei being sent on a desperate mission to find Enoch, the human who has witnessed and recorded the coming judgment. This journey is remarkable, not because of speed or strength, but because it represents recognition. The giants understand that their dreams, terrifying as they are, contain truths they cannot interpret alone. Mawei becomes a messenger, not by choice, but by necessity. His movement across the land reflects an ancient worldview in which communication between the realms is possible, but only through designated intermediaries. In Second Temple Jewish thought, messengers often carried burdens too great for ordinary mortals. The giant's panic is translated into urgency, and Mawei embodies that urgency. He does not question the message, he does not negotiate. He moves quickly to seek clarity. The journey itself is described with attention to detail in the manuscripts. Distances are great, challenges are implied, and the act of leaving the familiar for the unknown underscores the gravity of the situation. Historically, such journeys symbolize the recognition that knowledge is needed to avert disaster, or at least to understand it. The giant's reliance on Mawei mirrors human reliance on divinely appointed guides in other texts. He is both observer and participant, moving between worlds, yet belonging fully to neither. The texts emphasize his encounters with obstacles, reflecting the difficulties inherent in accessing divine wisdom. The role of Mawei is also to demonstrate that the giants, despite their strength and size, cannot act independently when faced with cosmic judgment. Their desperation is not merely emotional, it is existential. The need to consult Enoch is a recognition that understanding cannot come from force or fear. Ancient scribes preserved this moment to underline the importance of interpretation. Mawei's journey is not successful because it changes the outcome. The flood and judgment remain inevitable. Its significance lies in showing that even the most powerful beings seek counsel when confronted with certainty of consequence. Archaeological studies of Qumran texts confirm that these passages were carefully copied and valued. They were meant to convey principles rather than entertain. Mawei does not argue with Enoch. He listens, he records, he carries information back to the giants. In this, he becomes a bridge between human and monstrous perspectives. For ancient audiences, this narrative emphasizes the limits of autonomy. Knowledge and insight, even for giants, must be mediated. One cannot face the results of divine judgment alone. Mawei's journey shows that understanding is a process, often uncomfortable, often frightening. The giants' panic transforms into focused inquiry. Their terror finds a channel through Mawei, And yet, the lesson is immutable. The flood is coming. Judgment is certain. Even those who move fastest, who seek answers most desperately, cannot alter what has already been determined. In this moment, the narrative demonstrates the necessity of guidance and the inevitability of consequence, principles that extend beyond myth into the reflection of human and cosmic order. When Mahweh reaches Enoch, the human intermediary becomes the voice of judgment, the recorder of a verdict that cannot be ignored. The ancient texts describe the first reading of the scroll as an oracle. It is not a casual statement, but a formal declaration, carefully composed to be remembered and transmitted. Enoch delivers the words with precision, preserving the authority of the message while avoiding embellishment. The scroll itself is written in the language of scribes, not kings, emphasizing that wisdom and judgment are preserved through meticulous recording rather than through displays of power. According to the surviving fragments, Enoch warns the giants of the inevitable consequences of their actions. Their violence, their greed, their misuse of knowledge, and the corruption they have spread across the land cannot be undone. The oracle conveys both warning and verdict. It instructs the giants their actions have been observed, and that the flood will act as the ultimate response. The text repeatedly emphasizes certainty. There is no negotiation, no appeal. Judgment is absolute. Historically, the scroll's language reflects practices of the Second Temple period, when Jewish scribes meticulously copied texts to preserve authority and prevent misinterpretation. Every word, every phrase carries weight. The scroll is not meant to be understood casually. It is designed to instruct, to intimidate, and to create record for posterity. The reading of the scroll reveals the scale of the giants' transgressions. They are not simply violent, they have upset the natural and moral order, altered human and divine boundaries, and accelerated corruption beyond repair. The oracle communicates these realities without storytelling or dramatization. Its language is precise, legalistic, and formal. In the fragments, the giants react with confusion and fear. They hear the consequences laid out clearly, yet they cannot reverse them. The scroll functions both as law and prophecy. It preserves historical memory, explaining why the flood will be necessary while reinforcing moral principles for the future. Scholars note that the use of scribal language rather than the rhetoric of rulers indicates a focus on enduring truth over political authority. Enoch's reading does not glorify punishment, it emphasizes balance and consequence. The scroll is a record, a reminder, and a warning all at once. It marks the moment when divine oversight intersects with human and giant behavior. The oracle also serves to explain why the giants' dreams of destruction were true. The scroll confirms what they had glimpsed. Ancient scribes understood that written record carries authority. By recording the judgment in writing, Enoch ensures that future generations, whether human or otherwise, could consult the text and learn the principles embedded within it. The scroll is therefore more than a message. It is a tool of accountability. It guarantees that actions have consequences, that knowledge must be coupled with responsibility, and that even beings of great power are subject to oversight. The first reading establishes the standard. It sets the framework for all that follows, from continued warnings to the unfolding of the flood. In this way, the scroll preserves the balance between warning and judgment, memory and inevitability, ensuring that nothing is left uncertain. Among the fragments of the Book of Giants, certain names repeatedly appear, providing rare anchors in an otherwise incomplete record. Names like Oya and Haya are preserved across multiple manuscripts, showing that even as the larger story was lost, some identities remained significant. These names are not mythic titles, but proper nouns that point to individual giants, emphasizing their distinct personalities and roles in the unfolding crisis. Ancient scribes took care to record them accurately, suggesting that each figure carried importance in the moral and historical lessons of the text. The fact that these names survive in fragments indicates a much larger narrative once existed, one now mostly lost to time and decay. Historical studies of the Dead Sea Scrolls and other Second Temple period manuscripts confirm that the Book of Giants was widely copied, yet only pieces remain intact, making the preserved names valuable clues. Oya and Haya are mentioned in contexts that reveal their reactions to dreams, their interactions with Mahweh, and their confrontation with the oracle delivered by Enoch. These names function as more than identifiers. They connect readers to the individuals responsible for the corruption and chaos described in the texts. By naming the giants, scribes highlighted accountability, a crucial principle in the moral framework of the tradition. In addition, these names provide insight into linguistic and cultural practices of the time. Ohia and Hahia are transliterations from ancient Aramaic, reflecting the language of communities that preserved the scrolls. Their survival demonstrates the care taken in transmission, even as other parts of the narrative were lost or damaged. Scholars note that these names often appear in parallel with descriptions of deeds and consequences, reinforcing the idea that the giants were remembered not for mere presence, but for their actions and their moral implications. The fragments also hint at wider genealogical and hierarchical structures among the giants, with names serving as markers of lineage and authority. This suggests that the lost portions of the text contained more detailed accounts of relationships, interactions, and possibly individual stories of defiance and judgment. The survival of Ohia and Hahia has inspired later interpretations and adaptations, influencing how subsequent generations understood the narrative of the giants. Even without full context, these names evoke the scale of the events and the persistent theme of accountability. Archaeological and textual analysis confirms that the emphasis on names aligns with broader Jewish traditions of recording lineage, responsibility, and moral exemplars. Each name carries weight, serving as a reminder that actions are inseparable from identity. In the absence of complete manuscripts, these preserved names become touchstones for understanding the otherwise lost narrative. They point to a civilization deeply concerned with moral order, historical record, and the enduring consequences of transgression. The fragments leave us with glimpses of a larger story, hinting at complexity, detail, and a warning that stretches beyond the immediate events. Names like Oya and Hahia ensure that even in partial records, memory persists, lessons endure, and the echoes of the giants' deeds are not entirely silenced. The texts of the Second Temple period describe a world in which corruption has become so pervasive that continuation is no longer possible. The giants, as offspring of the Watchers and human women, embody this breakdown. They are not only physically imposing, but their actions accelerate moral and social collapse. Violence spreads unchecked. The misuse of knowledge introduced by the Watchers compounds the disorder. Agriculture is disrupted, communities are destabilized, and the natural balance of the land is threatened. Ancient writers use the giant's behavior as a symbol for what happens when creation itself falls out of alignment. Historical context shows that these texts were preserved during periods of political instability and foreign domination, when real societies experience cycles of violence and moral decay. The narrative of a world too corrupt to continue resonates with the concerns of scribes attempting to explain catastrophe and divine intervention. In the Enochic and related texts, repeated emphasis is placed on the magnitude of transgression. Human sins alone are insufficient to explain the coming flood. The giants amplify the effects, their violence tipping the balance beyond repair. Their greed, destruction, and rebellion illustrate a principle widely recognized in ancient Near Eastern thought. When actions violate the natural order and divine law, consequences follow not gradually, but decisively. The texts stress that this is a cumulative process. Each act of violence, each misuse of knowledge, each display of power without responsibility contributes to the tipping point. By the time judgment is announced, the world has passed the threshold of correction. The ancient scribes framed this scenario as a warning, not only to giants, but to human listeners as well. The moral lesson is clear. Boundaries exist for a reason. Overstepping them endangers not only the transgressor, but the entire system. Archaeological evidence from Qumran indicates that these scrolls were repeatedly copied, suggesting their message about the dangers of imbalance was considered essential for future generations. The emphasis on systemic collapse shows a sophisticated understanding of cause and effect. The giant's rampage is detailed with attention to the spread of violence and disorder, emphasizing that no single event triggers catastrophe alone. Instead, a network of transgressions produces outcomes beyond human control. This concept mirrors observations in historical societies, where persistent corruption and unchecked power often precede societal collapse. The texts also note the interplay between physical might and moral failure. Strength without wisdom, size without restraint, and influence without accountability all contribute to the tipping point. The flood is framed as the necessary response to a world no longer capable of sustaining itself. It is not arbitrary, it is corrective. The narrative portrays the judgment as inevitable, logical, and grounded in principle. The giants' actions crystallize the point of no return. Their existence, though terrifying, serves as an instructional example. The Enochic tradition underscores that balance, restraint, and adherence to moral order are essential for continuity. When these are lost, the world itself becomes unsustainable. The message of a world too corrupt to continue endures as a reflection on consequence, oversight, and the limits of power, reminding all readers that imbalance carries inevitable reckoning. The ancient texts present the flood as more than a natural disaster. In Enochic tradition and related Second Temple period writings, the deluge is framed as a judicial act, a response to a world that has become irreparably corrupt. It is not arbitrary, it is deliberate. The giants' violence, the spread of forbidden knowledge, and the moral failures of humanity together create a situation beyond correction. The flood is the endpoint of a process, a sentence imposed by divine authority. Historically, the concept of a flood as judgment appears in multiple ancient Near Eastern cultures, from Mesopotamian epics to Hebrew scriptures, suggesting a shared understanding that catastrophic water could represent moral or divine adjudication. In these texts, water becomes both instrument and symbol. It cleanses the land, removes excess, and restores potential for ordered life. The Enochic texts describe how the flood is directed with precision. Not all life is annihilated. Noah and his family survive, preserving the seeds of renewal. This illustrates the dual nature of the deluge as punishment and preparation for restoration. The judicial framing is reinforced by the presence of oracles and warnings delivered in advance. Enoch, as a messenger, communicates the consequences of transgression clearly. The giants and humanity are made aware of the sentence before it is carried out, emphasizing the fairness and inevitability of judgment. Archaeological studies and textual analysis of Dead Sea Scroll fragments show repeated emphasis on this aspect of the flood. Scribes carefully preserved language that communicates authority, cause, and effect. It is not a tale of random catastrophe. The flood is depicted as the logical conclusion to ongoing violations of divine law and natural order. The texts stress proportionality. The punishment corresponds directly to the level of corruption present. This judicial perspective frames the flood as a principle-based action. It is a reminder that actions, particularly those that disrupt balance and morality, have consequences that extend beyond their immediate observation. The narrative of the flood as sentence also addresses the anxieties of the scribes' historical context. Living under empires, facing invasion, and observing social and moral instability, the communities that preserved these texts recognize the importance of order, oversight, and accountability. The flood is an extreme manifestation of these principles. By presenting it as judicial, the texts reinforce the idea that the universe is governed by law and reason, even when human perception cannot grasp it fully. The giants' destruction exemplifies this. Their power, knowledge, and violence make them irredeemable in the system of divine oversight. The flood ends their reign and resets the world. It also educates future generations. By recording the flood as sentence rather than accident, the scribes establish a moral precedent. They show that imbalance cannot persist without consequence. The deluge is thus an instrument of justice, a historical judgment, and a lesson on the limits of power. It demonstrates that a world too corrupt to continue must be corrected to restore potential for life, order, and ethical accountability. When the waters of the flood finally recede, the world that emerges is both familiar and unrecognizable. According to the ancient texts, the landscape bears the marks of judgment, yet life begins anew in scattered patches. The giants, the primary agents of corruption, are gone. Humanity is greatly reduced. Civilization must restart, with the knowledge of past transgressions embedded in memory and rumor rather than formal record. The Enochic and related Second Temple period writings emphasize that even though the witnesses of the previous age are gone, their actions are not entirely forgotten. Names, fragmentary accounts, and oral traditions persist, carried by survivors and scribes who recognize the importance of remembrance. Historically, this reflects the way ancient societies transmitted knowledge when written records were incomplete or lost. Memory and rumor act as informal archives, preserving lessons and warnings. The survivors, including Noah and his family, carry both practical skills and moral awareness into the new world. They understand that rebuilding requires caution and fidelity to ethical norms. The texts also note that certain fragments of knowledge, particularly about the giants and the Watchers, survive in mysterious ways. Some information is encoded in dreams, some in local stories, and some in the partial scrolls that later generations will discover. Archaeological evidence supports this notion. Fragments of texts and inscriptions from different regions suggest that traditions of extraordinary beings and divine oversight were preserved despite social upheaval. This survival of memory highlights the resilience of cultural and moral teaching. Even in the absence of witnesses, a society can carry forward lessons crucial to its continuity. The writings suggest that memory alone cannot fully convey the scale of past events, but it can maintain awareness of consequence, boundaries, and justice. In addition, the scattering of tradition allows for reinterpretation and adaptation. Names like Oya and Haya, references to giants, continue to appear in later stories, indicating that certain aspects of the narrative were influential even in reduced form. The flood resets the ecological and social environment, but it does not erase the ethical and historical consciousness embedded in humanity. The texts emphasize the delicate balance between forgetting and remembering. To forget entirely would risk repeating previous errors. To remember allows a moral compass to guide reconstruction. The fragments suggest that survivors teach through example and story. Lessons are passed in cautionary form, shaping the behavior and expectations of the new generations. The recurrence of names and partial accounts demonstrates that no matter how catastrophic an event, cultural memory persists. Even when scribes are absent, oral traditions, symbolic practices, and scattered texts ensure continuity. In this way, the aftermath of the flood is more than a geographical or demographic reset. It is a recalibration of moral and historical understanding. The world begins again, but the echoes of what came before insist on presence, influence, and warning. Even in silence, the memory of the giants, the watchers, and the divine sentence continues to inform human perception of power, responsibility, and consequence. Long after the flood, the story of the giants and the watchers does not disappear. Instead, it survives in the careful hands of scribes. The ancient texts, particularly those preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls, show that Jewish scribal communities were responsible for maintaining these traditions. Unlike empires or temples that focused on political authority or official rituals, the scribes prioritized memory, precision, and moral instruction. They copied texts meticulously, often in multiple manuscripts, ensuring that the stories of the flood, the giants, and the watchers weren't lost, even as kingdoms rose and fell around them. Historically, these scribal efforts occurred during the Second Temple period, a time when Judea was under Persian, Greek, and later Roman influence. Political powers were concerned with governance, taxation, and public order, not the preservation of moral allegories or mythic history. The scribes became the guardians of continuity, transmitting knowledge through written fragments, commentaries, and oral instruction. This approach ensured that even when centralized authority shifted, the story remained intact. In the fragments, we see that scribes often emphasized accuracy over embellishment. Names, lineages, and events were recorded precisely, even when details were incomplete or ambiguous. This attention to detail allowed later scholars to reconstruct portions of the narrative with a degree of confidence, despite the absence of full manuscripts. The decision to preserve the story outside of official temple or state archives reflects a strategic understanding of cultural survival. Scribes recognized that official institutions might suppress or reinterpret the narrative for political reasons. By keeping it within their circles, they maintained control over interpretation and ensured that ethical and cosmological lessons were transmitted faithfully. Archaeological evidence from Qumran and other Second Temple period sites shows that these scribal communities operated quietly, often in remote locations away from the central temple authorities. Their focus was not power, but preservation. The texts reveal layers of annotation, careful corrections, and cross-references, indicating the care with which knowledge was managed. The scribe's role also highlights a broader principle in ancient culture. Memory and history are fragile. When power structures fail, only those who actively preserve records can maintain continuity. By storing and copying the stories of the giants, the watchers, and the flood, scribes provided a bridge between past catastrophes and future understanding. The tradition they safeguarded was more than narrative. It was a repository of moral and cosmic principles. Even centuries later, when political regimes shifted, these scribal copies survived, informing later Jewish and eventually Christian traditions. Scribes ensured that the lessons of transgression, consequence, and divine oversight remained available for reflection, interpretation, and teaching. By keeping the story outside official archives, they protected it from alteration, allowing it to endure as a consistent moral and historical framework across generations. In this way, the preservation of the narrative depended not on kings or temples, but on the quiet diligence of those who valued memory over power, instruction over authority, and fidelity over fame. During the Second Temple period, the Judean wilderness becomes a crucial site for the preservation of sacred and forbidden knowledge. The texts of the Book of Giants, along with other Enochic writings, were copied, hidden, and safeguarded in remote locations far from the centers of political and religious authority. Archaeological discoveries at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, confirm that scribes and small communities sought isolation to ensure the survival of their manuscripts. These desert sites provided protection from looting, destruction, and interference during periods of instability, including the Hasmonean conflicts and Roman occupation. The environment of the wilderness itself, harsh and unpopulated, created natural barriers that preserved fragile scrolls from environmental damage and human tampering. Historically, scribes employed meticulous techniques, using durable parchment, careful ink preparation, and codified writing styles to maximize the longevity of their work. The act of copying was both practical and symbolic. Each iteration reinforced the authority of the text and ensured that the lessons regarding the giants, the watchers, and the flood remained accessible to future generations. The desert setting also reflects a spiritual and ethical choice. By retreating from urban centers and official temples, scribes demonstrated their commitment to truth and moral instruction over political influence. The instability outside, whether due to war, empire, or social unrest, posed a threat to the continuity of tradition. Hiding scrolls in caves and other natural shelters allowed knowledge to survive, even when communities were displaced or destroyed. Scholars note that many of these manuscripts were stored in clusters, sometimes rolled and sealed, indicating intentional preservation rather than accidental abandonment. Fragments discovered over decades show that multiple copies of the same work were maintained, providing redundancy in case some were lost. The desert environment also created a context for reflection and study. Communities could engage with the texts without external pressure, ensuring accurate transmission and interpretation. The narrative of the Book of Giants and associated Enochic literature demonstrates the importance placed on continuity and fidelity. Preservation in the wilderness ensured that the stories, warnings, and moral frameworks embedded in the scrolls were not diluted by political agendas or shifts in religious leadership. The desert acted as both archive and classroom, where scribes could observe, copy, and meditate upon the text's content, reinforcing the lessons on the dangers of transgression, the consequences of misuse of knowledge, and the inevitability of divine judgment. By securing the scrolls in the Judean wilderness, the scribes created a temporal bridge between the catastrophic events described in the narratives and the generations that would study them centuries later. The isolation of the desert was not a limitation, but a safeguard, a deliberate strategy to protect cultural and ethical memory from the instability and impermanence of the human world. The survival of these scrolls ultimately demonstrates that the careful work of a few dedicated individuals can preserve knowledge across centuries, ensuring that even the most fragile threads of history and moral teaching endure, despite external chaos. The Qumran caves, perched above the Dead Sea, became the final resting place for countless scrolls, including fragments of the Book of Giants. During the Second Temple period, scribes intentionally sealed these manuscripts away in clay jars and hidden niches to protect them from destruction during times of social unrest, invasion, and religious conflict. Archaeological evidence confirms that the caves were used systematically for preservation. Scrolls were rolled, sometimes wrapped in linen, and carefully placed in conditions that would minimize decay. These manuscripts weren't meant to be read immediately. They were hidden with the expectation that future generations, capable of understanding and respecting their content, would eventually recover and interpret them. The fragments discovered in the 20th century show that many of the scrolls were incomplete, with missing sections and delicate parchment that had suffered the effects of time. Yet their survival is remarkable, given the environmental conditions. Historians and scholars note that the Qumran caves functioned as both archive and sanctuary, a place where knowledge could remain intact, while the outside world faced wars, political shifts, and cultural upheaval. The Book of Giants fragments, for example, include names, genealogies, and moral instructions that would have been critical for understanding the broader narrative of the Watchers, the Giants, and the Flood. These fragments reveal not only content, but also the scribe's methodical care. Multiple copies of key passages were stored in different locations, suggesting a redundancy designed to safeguard against loss. The text fragments themselves, written in Aramaic, Hebrew, and sometimes Greek, reflect the linguistic diversity of the period and the scribe's commitment to accuracy. In addition to physical preservation, the placement of scrolls in the caves represents an understanding of temporal preservation. The scribes recognized that their audience might not exist in the immediate future. By burying the scrolls, they created a time capsule intended to transmit knowledge across centuries. This approach allowed moral and historical lessons regarding the giants' transgression and the consequences of their actions to endure, despite centuries of upheaval. The act of concealment was deliberate and reflects a sophisticated strategy of knowledge management. When the Qumran caves were rediscovered in the mid-20th century, scholars realized that these fragments offered unprecedented insight into ancient Jewish thought, apocalyptic literature, and the moral frameworks embedded in Second Temple period traditions. The Book of Giants, once hidden in the shadows of Qumran, now provides context for understanding the fears, ethics, and theological interpretations of a civilization that valued careful preservation over immediate dissemination. These buried scrolls, though fragmentary, form a bridge between the ancient world and modern scholarship. They demonstrate that knowledge can survive centuries when entrusted to those who understand its significance. The Qumran caves ensured that even the most fragile and controversial texts, once lost to memory, could eventually resurface, allowing humanity to reconstruct the narratives and lessons of a distant past. In 1947, a remarkable discovery changed our understanding of ancient Jewish literature and apocalyptic tradition. Bedouin shepherds near the Dead Sea stumbled upon hidden caves containing ancient scrolls and fragments that had remained sealed for over 2,000 years. These manuscripts, now known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, included previously unknown texts such as the Book of Giants, which had been preserved in the Qumran caves by Jewish scribal communities during the Second Temple period. The unearthing of these scrolls brought the Giants' tradition back into public view, revealing narratives that had been lost or known only through fragments and later references. Scholars quickly realized the importance of these texts. They provided direct evidence of Enochic literature, the story of the Watchers, and the hybrid offspring known as giants, along with moral and cosmological lessons that had been carefully preserved by scribes centuries earlier. The discovery also demonstrated the meticulous practices of ancient scribes. Scrolls were found in clay jars, often wrapped in linen, and in some cases multiple copies of the same work were hidden in separate caves, reflecting deliberate efforts to ensure survival despite environmental decay or human interference. The Book of Giants fragments include names, genealogies, and accounts of dreams and warnings that had never before been available to modern readers, offering insight into how Jewish communities in the late Second Temple period conceptualized corruption, divine judgment, and the limits of human and supernatural power. The 19th and 20th century interest in biblical archaeology meant that once the scrolls were recovered, they were studied with unprecedented care, using advances in paleography, chemistry, and digital imaging to reconstruct fragile fragments. The Giants tradition, which had once existed quietly in scribal circles, suddenly became a subject of public and academic fascination. Discussions about the Watchers, the transmission of forbidden knowledge, and the moral consequences of hubris entered mainstream scholarship, religious studies, and popular culture. The rediscovery also illuminated the continuity and variation within Jewish thought across centuries. It became clear that scribes had not only preserved historical memory, but had also curated it, emphasizing lessons on justice, responsibility, and cosmic order. For modern audiences, the discovery of these scrolls connected distant historical periods, bridging the Second Temple era with contemporary study. The Book of Giants and related texts showed that themes of transgression, warning, and divine response were central to ancient ethical thinking, and had been consciously transmitted despite political, environmental, and social upheaval. This rediscovery did not simply provide content for historians. It also invited reflection on how knowledge is preserved, lost, and recovered across millennia. The 20th century unveiling of the Dead Sea Scrolls thus reintroduced the Giants tradition, making visible a fragment of ancient history that had been hidden for centuries, demonstrating the resilience of cultural memory and the enduring impact of scribal preservation on our understanding of the past. After the initial discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, scholars began to carefully examine the fragments, identifying texts that corresponded to a previously known but poorly understood tradition called the Book of Giants. Written in Aramaic, these fragments aligned closely with references found in later sources, including the Ethiopic Book of Enoch and Jewish apocryphal writings. Historians and linguists noted that the scrolls contain names, genealogies, and narratives that had only survived indirectly until this point, confirming the existence of a coherent literary tradition focused on the Watchers, their hybrid offspring, and the consequences of transgression. The Aramaic fragments were dated to approximately the 2nd century BCE, during the late Second Temple period, a time when Jewish communities were producing apocalyptic literature that explored the limits of human and divine interaction. The texts included accounts of giants receiving troubling dreams, the delegation of Mahweh to consult Enoch, and the subsequent pronouncement of judgment, providing direct evidence that these stories were recorded centuries before later adaptations. Scholars emphasized that the Book of Giants is not a singular text, but a collection of narratives with overlapping themes, preserved in multiple copies, often in fragmentary condition, reflecting careful scribal transmission. The discovery clarified earlier ambiguities, showing that the giants weren't simply metaphorical figures, but part of a structured cosmology that addressed human corruption, divine oversight, and moral accountability. Linguistic analysis confirmed the sophistication of the scribes, who maintained consistent terminology, proper names, and narrative sequences, indicating that this literature was meant to be authoritative and enduring. The fragments also revealed variations in the text, suggesting regional or community-specific differences in interpretation, a common feature in Second Temple period writings. The Book of Giants' re-emergence in the 20th century reshaped modern understanding of Jewish apocalyptic thought, illustrating how themes of divine justice, transgression, and the consequences of forbidden knowledge were central to ancient ethical frameworks. Previously, knowledge of the giants was limited to references in later traditions, leaving gaps in chronology, character identity, and moral teaching. The Aramaic fragments restored these missing elements, demonstrating that the giant story was actively transmitted and preserved well before Christian or medieval interpretations. The rediscovery also sparked renewed interest in comparative studies, linking Mesopotamian, biblical, and Second Temple period traditions, showing that motifs such as hybrid beings, divine oversight, and cataclysmic judgment were part of a broader cultural and religious conversation across the ancient Near East. By revealing the original language, structure, and intent of the Book of Giants, scholars were able to trace the evolution of the text, understand its historical context, and clarify the role of scribes in maintaining continuity across centuries. The reappearance of the Book of Giants confirmed that the narrative was never entirely lost, but carefully preserved, waiting for the modern age to reconstruct its messages about morality, divine law, and the consequences of human and supernatural overreach. After the collapse of the Second Temple period, the stories preserved by Jewish scribes did not vanish entirely. Elements of the giants' tradition found their way into new religious movements, most notably within Manichaean communities that emerged in the 3rd century CE. Manichaeism, founded by the prophet Mani in Persia, drew on a diverse array of traditions, including Jewish, Christian, and Zoroastrian teachings. Within this syncretic framework, the narrative of the Watchers, the giants, and the flood was adapted to fit a dualistic cosmology that emphasized the struggle between light and darkness, spirit and matter. Scholars examining Manichaean texts have identified motifs and names reminiscent of the Book of Giants, suggesting that the story's moral and cosmic lessons were preserved even as its original cultural and theological context shifted. The giants, previously framed as hybrid beings whose violence destabilized the world, were reinterpreted as forces aligned with darkness, embodying the corrupting influence of materiality and rebellion against divine order. This adaptation demonstrates the flexibility and resilience of the narrative. Historical research indicates that Manichaean communities maintained written texts, often in Syriac, Middle Persian, and Coptic, enabling the transmission of these adapted stories across vast regions from Persia to North Africa. Archaeological discoveries, including fragmentary Manichaean manuscripts, show that elements of the giants' tradition survived in codified forms, integrated into cosmological expositions, ethical instruction, and allegorical teaching. The survival of the story in a new religious setting underscores a broader phenomenon: that narratives with compelling moral and cosmic significance are rarely lost, even when original communities dissolve or texts are fragmented. Scholars note that the retelling within Manichaeism emphasizes the didactic function of the giants' narrative, framing their transgression and destruction as a warning about the consequences of turning away from divine light. This reframing also allowed the narrative to resonate with audiences unfamiliar with Second Temple Jewish traditions. Linguistic analysis shows how names, motifs, and structural elements were preserved, though often modified to fit the new dualistic cosmology. The adaptation highlights the importance of scribal networks and textual memory across cultures. Even when the original scrolls were hidden in the Judean wilderness or buried in Qumran, oral traditions, copied fragments, and theological reinterpretation ensured continuity. The giant story, in this context, demonstrates how moral and cosmic lessons can transcend cultural and temporal boundaries. The Manichaean version preserves the essence of the narrative: rebellion, corruption, and divine judgment, while situating it within a framework that aligns with new ethical and spiritual priorities. By tracing the transmission from Jewish scribal communities to Manichaean practitioners, scholars can observe a direct line of preservation and adaptation. The narrative's survival in a new religion illustrates the enduring power of carefully preserved texts, the flexibility of moral storytelling, and the capacity of human communities to maintain ethical and cosmological memory even as societies transform. The giants' tradition, though altered in interpretation and context, continues to carry the warning, the moral clarity, and the cosmic order first recorded centuries earlier, proving that even lost stories can endure in unexpected forms. The surviving fragments of the Book of Giants provide a rare window into an ancient narrative, but they are incomplete, damaged, and often fragmentary. Scholars emphasize that careful analysis is required to separate what the texts actually say from later interpretations, reconstruction, or legend. The Aramaic fragments found in the Qumran caves contain names, genealogical details, references to dreams, and warnings delivered to giants by Mahweh and Enoch. These elements are considered historically reliable because they appear consistently across multiple fragments, suggesting deliberate preservation by scribes during the Second Temple period. The fragments also confirm the presence of specific motifs, including the giants' corruption, their reception of troubling dreams, the consultation with Enoch, and the pronouncement of divine judgment. Linguistic studies indicate that the text was composed with precision, using scribal conventions that were standard for the period, reinforcing the authority of the content. At the same time, gaps in the manuscripts prevent a complete reconstruction of events. Large sections are missing, leaving questions about the sequence of actions, detailed interactions among the giants, and the full scope of the Watcher's transgressions. Scholars caution that anything beyond the directly attested fragments must be treated as informed reconstruction rather than historical fact. The fragments do not provide narrative embellishment, moral interpretation, or theological commentary beyond the warning and description of wrongdoing, which is why historians distinguish between the verified content and subsequent layers of legend or adaptation in later texts, such as the Ethiopic Book of Enoch or Manichaean writings. The reliable content establishes that the giants were hybrid beings whose behavior destabilized human and natural order, that Maweh served as a messenger, and that Enoch delivered warnings preserved in writing for moral and cosmological purposes. Archaeological and textual evidence supports the dating of these fragments to approximately the 2nd century BCE, confirming that this tradition existed centuries before its incorporation into later religious or mythological frameworks. By focusing on what the fragments actually say, researchers can reconstruct a skeletal understanding of the giant's story, without assuming details that are not explicitly present. This approach helps clarify which elements are genuinely attested in Second Temple period literature, and which have been added through later retellings, translation, or adaptation. For example, while later sources expand on names, lineage, or the narrative of the flood, the fragments themselves provide only selective references, emphasizing warning, consequence, and the moral responsibility of beings with power. The distinction between evidence and legend is crucial for the modern scholarship, allowing historians to identify core ethical and cosmological concepts while acknowledging the limitations of the surviving record. The fragments, though incomplete, reliably indicate that a story existed, warning about the consequences of transgression, the misuse of knowledge, and the eventual divine response, forming a foundation upon which later traditions could build, without obscuring the original moral and historical message. In this way, the surviving pieces serve as both evidence and guide, grounding understanding of the giant's story in what is attested, while cautioning against over-interpretation or unfounded reconstruction. The story of the giants and the flood finds parallels across the broader ancient Near East, revealing shared concerns about primeval corruption and divine judgment. Mesopotamian texts, including the Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh epic, describe a world filled with violence, overpopulation, and human impiety, prompting the gods to send a great flood. These narratives, composed between the 19th and 17th centuries BCE, provide context for understanding why the Jewish tradition of the Watchers and the Giants resonated within its historical milieu. Both the Mesopotamian and Jewish accounts emphasize the consequences of transgression and the disruption of order. In the Mesopotamian context, human beings and supernatural entities both contribute to the breakdown, echoing the dual involvement of Watchers and human women in the giant's origin. Similarly, Egyptian texts preserve themes of cosmic imbalance, where disorder in the human or natural realm invites divine intervention, reinforcing the universality of the concern with moral and cosmic disruption. Scholars note that these parallels indicate a widespread cultural preoccupation with explaining catastrophe through narrative and attributing it to ethical failure or excess. The giants narrative, preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls, integrates this broader framework while incorporating distinctive Jewish theological elements, such as the role of Enoch as intermediary and scribe, and the ethical lesson that knowledge and power must be exercised responsibly. Comparative studies reveal that names, structural motifs, and narrative devices such as divine warning, dreams, and judgment appear across multiple cultures, suggesting both diffusion and independent reflection on similar existential concerns. The story's resonance is further supported by the consistency of its transmission within Jewish communities, where scribes preserved fragments for centuries despite political and social instability, indicating that these themes were considered central to moral and cosmological understanding. Archaeological and textual research shows that the emphasis on hybrid beings, moral transgression, and divine response is not unique to the Book of Giants. In Babylonian literature, semi-divine beings and demigods act as intermediaries or disruptors, much like the Watchers, demonstrating an ancient preoccupation with the boundary between human and divine action. These shared motifs reflect broader questions about hierarchy, power, and responsibility within early civilizations, explaining why the giants' story maintained significance over millennia. The flood, as a corrective measure, also resonates across cultures, serving as both a literal and symbolic reset of creation, a narrative device to teach about the consequences of corruption. By situating the Book of Giants within this wider context, historians can appreciate its continuity with regional traditions while recognizing its unique contributions, including its moral emphasis, literary structure, and the careful preservation of names and events. The Giants narrative, therefore, is part of a larger discourse in the ancient Near East, exploring the tension between freedom and transgression, human and divine responsibility, and the ultimate consequences of disrupting the natural and moral order. These parallels explain both the story's original impact and its enduring relevance in subsequent religious and cultural traditions, demonstrating that it addresses concerns common to multiple societies while preserving distinctive Jewish insights. The disappearance of the Book of Giants and related texts for many centuries can be attributed to a combination of political upheaval, changing religious canons, and the inherent fragility of ancient manuscripts. During the late Second Temple period, Judea experienced repeated invasions, including the Babylonian conquest in 586 BCE and later Roman occupation, which disrupted communities and threatened the survival of written records. Scribes often hid scrolls in caves, jars, and other secure locations to protect them from destruction. Yet this concealment also meant that texts could easily be forgotten over time. Manuscripts composed on parchment and papyrus are inherently delicate, susceptible to decay, moisture, fire, and pests. Even under optimal conditions, the passage of centuries leads to fragmentation, loss, and fading, leaving only partial evidence of once complete works. The development of religious canons further influenced the preservation and loss of texts. As the Hebrew Bible and later Christian Old Testament were formalized, certain writings, including apocryphal and pseudepigraphal texts, were excluded from official scripture. The Book of Giants, classified as non-canonical, was transmitted only in select scribal communities, rather than maintained in public or state-supported archives, limiting its circulation and increasing the risk of disappearance. Political instability also played a role. Revolts, wars, and the destruction of cities and temples disrupted scholarly activity, scattering communities that had copied and preserved texts. When manuscripts were hidden or abandoned, few had the means or authority to maintain them over generations. Fragmentary survival was sometimes accidental. Clay jars might break, scrolls could be partially consumed by mold or insects, and portions of caves could collapse, leaving only shards for future discovery. Over time, cultural memory preserved names, events, and key motifs in oral traditions, but without complete manuscripts, the full narrative of the giants was inaccessible. The rediscovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947 illustrates how these texts can survive despite centuries of obscurity. Archaeological evidence shows that multiple copies of the same work were sometimes stored in different caves, indicating that ancient communities understood the vulnerability of manuscripts and took steps to create redundancy. Even so, many fragments were incomplete, emphasizing the fragility of knowledge transmission across centuries. Shifting political and religious contexts also influenced which texts were deemed important to preserve or suppress. Non-canonical writings faced neglect or intentional concealment, while officially sanctioned texts received ongoing copying and dissemination. This dynamic explains why major traditions like the Book of Giants survive only as shards, rather than complete works. The combination of environmental vulnerability, political disruption, and selective preservation decisions by scribes and religious authorities created a historical environment in which the narrative endured in fragments, transmitted through careful custodianship rather than continuous public record. These surviving pieces allow modern scholars to reconstruct aspects of the story, while acknowledging the limits imposed by time, demonstrating how texts can persist across millennia, even when much of their original content is lost. The process of reconstructing the Book of Giants from fragmentary texts has become a central aspect of modern scholarship, shaping how the narrative is understood today. Since the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947, researchers have carefully pieced together Aramaic fragments found in Qumran caves, analyzing language, handwriting, and contextual clues to determine the most likely sequence of events. Translation plays a crucial role in this effort. Aramaic, the language of the fragments, contains nuances, idioms, and terms that do not always have direct equivalents in modern languages, requiring scholars to make interpretive choices that influence the reconstructed narrative. Multiple teams of researchers often produce slightly different restorations, reflecting competing interpretations of missing or damaged sections. For example, gaps in the text must be filled using comparative analysis with the Ethiopic Book of Enoch, Manichaean adaptations, and other Second Temple period literature. But each restoration involves an element of educated conjecture. Archaeologists and textual critics emphasize that while some passages are securely reconstructed, others remain tentative, highlighting the balance between evidence and interpretation. This careful work allows the giant's narrative to be reconstructed in a form that is coherent, while still acknowledging gaps, inconsistencies, and uncertainties. Modern reconstructions also consider historical context, cross-referencing events, names, and motifs with known cultural, religious, and literary trends from the late Second Temple period. The story of the Watchers, the giants, their dreams, and Enoch's warnings is thus framed within both its original moral and cosmological framework and the broader Near Eastern tradition of flood and corruption narratives. Scholarly publications often include critical apparatuses that show alternative readings, noting where different reconstructions might alter understanding of character motivations, sequences of events, or theological implications. This transparency ensures that the reconstructed story is not treated as definitive, but as a carefully reasoned interpretation of fragmentary evidence. In addition, advances in imaging, digital reconstruction, and paleography have allowed scholars to recover details invisible to the naked eye, further refining the narrative. These technologies provide a more precise understanding of text placement, scribal errors, and missing lines, which can influence translation and interpretation. The reconstructed Book of Giants, as it exists today, is therefore both a product of ancient scribal preservation and modern scholarly methodology. It demonstrates how historical knowledge can be pieced together from broken lines while maintaining rigorous standards of evidence and interpretation. By examining fragments, comparing linguistic forms, and situating the text in its broader historical and literary context, scholars create a version of the giant story that honors the original ethical and cosmological concerns, even as it navigates gaps and uncertainties. The modern reconstruction itself becomes part of the story, highlighting the ongoing dialogue between the past and present, between the surviving fragments and contemporary understanding, ensuring that the giant's narrative continues to inform and challenge readers while remaining anchored in historical scholarship. The Book of Giants, despite modern discoveries and reconstructions, remains incomplete, leaving scholars and readers with a profound sense of mystery. The fragments recovered from the Qumran caves, dating to approximately the 2nd century BCE, provide glimpses into a narrative of giants, watchers, dreams, and divine judgment. But large portions are irretrievably lost. Archaeological evidence confirms that the manuscripts were hidden carefully and preserved intentionally, yet centuries of decay, displacement, and selective copying mean that entire sections, including potential explanations, dialogues, and moral reflections, may never be recovered. Historians emphasize the distinction between what can be proven from extant fragments and what must be inferred through comparative analysis, translation, and contextual study. The Aramaic text establishes names, genealogies, and key episodes reliably, but gaps require scholars to consult the Ethiopic Book of Enoch, Manichaean adaptations, and other Second Temple literature to suggest likely connections and narrative continuity. Even with careful reconstruction, it is clear that some chapters, lessons, or interpretations are still missing, leaving unanswered questions about the full scope of the giant's story, the extent of the Watcher's transgression, and the complete ethical framework intended by the original scribes. The mystery of the last page, or pages, highlights the fragility of ancient textual transmission and the ingenuity of the scribes who attempted to preserve knowledge under unstable conditions. These lost portions may contain names, genealogical details, or theological reflections that would illuminate aspects of the narrative we currently only glimpse. The rediscovery of fragments in 1947 and subsequent scholarly work demonstrate both the resilience of textual memory and the inevitable limitations imposed by time, decay, and historical upheaval. By analyzing the fragments in combination with comparative literature, scholars can construct a coherent narrative that conveys the story's central ethical, cosmological, and moral lessons, but must always acknowledge the possibility that some elements have been permanently lost. The enduring fascination with the Book of Giants lies in this balance between certainty and conjecture, evidence and inference. It reminds us that ancient texts were vulnerable to both natural and human forces, and that our understanding of history depends on what survived, as well as what has disappeared. The mystery of missing chapters invites ongoing exploration, critical study, and careful interpretation, ensuring that the giant story continues to inspire questions about transgression, divine oversight, and the consequences of power. Even as scholars reconstruct, translate, and contextualize the text, the final portions remain unseen, their content speculative, but profoundly significant. This uncertainty does not diminish the value of the surviving narrative. Instead, it underscores the importance of preservation, careful scholarship, and critical analysis in reconstructing human history. The last page that never returned symbolizes both the limits of our knowledge and the enduring intrigue of the past, reminding us that some stories, even after millennia, remain partially hidden, waiting for future discoveries to fill the gaps, and that the pursuit of understanding is itself a bridge connecting modern readers to the scribes, traditions, and moral vision of the ancient world.